When you buy glass for bead making, it usually comes in a rod shape.
Mm-hmm.
They pull it across the studio, actually, into long pieces that are sometimes 20 feet long. And then they cut it up once it's cooled to about 1,000 degrees into sections using a tool like this, which snips the rod. The person, of course, doing that is wearing heavy gloves. And then the rods are thrown into an annealing kiln where they're slowly cooled down to room temperature. And you end up, usually when you're buying glass rods from a company, they ship them, they're about this size, it's about 12 inches, maybe a little less, and 6 millimeters around. And that's because most bead making torches will heat up about an inch of glass in their working area in the flame, and this allows you to make one round bead each time you heat up that amount, the gather it's called. So there is a method to why the rods are sold the way they are. Although even as you see, because they're hand pulled, there's size differentiation between these two rods. The ivory is smaller and the white is a little larger. And they do sell larger size rods, particularly for glasses that you use a lot of. For instance, clear, which is used quite a bit for something called encasing, where you're making something complicated and then covering it with a big layer of clear. You go through a lot of clear. So they sell an extra large size clear rod, I believe, that's 10 millimeters across, almost a centimeter, because then you can heat up a big mass of clear and cover an entire bead in one swipe. So that's how you buy glass in these rod shapes. And the rods come from different companies, depending on which glass you're using, and your choice of which glass you're using. Well, it depends on what you're doing, but it also depends on what you've set as your standard in the studio. Some companies make glass that contracts at a certain rate, and some companies make glass that contracts at a different rate. And actually, it's funnily enough, and in science there's always this contradiction. The unit they use for describing this is called the coefficient of expansion instead of contraction. But it's the contraction that matters, because as the glass is cooling and contracts, if two different colors are contracting at two different rates, then the bead will shatter because it develops too much stress. So when you're making colored glass beads, you usually buy your glass from the same company, or by companies that all use the same base coefficient of expansion, or COE. And if you go onto a bead making website or a website of a catalog of a bead making company, you'll see that all the glasses are rated by their COE first, because they're all built on the same base clear glass, and that's the primary driver of the COE. Here in my studio, almost all of the glass has a COE of 104, which is the Italian standard set by Moretti, which is a company which produces glass and has been for hundreds of years on the Isle of Murano in Venice. But the other big standards in North America, the largest glass company in North America is called Spectrum, and they use a COE of 96. And a lot of the special glasses that are produced by smaller companies like Sandberg's, which produces the beautiful dichroic glass that has that super sheen that you see a lot of dichroic glass jewelry, that comes on a 96 COE base. So to work with that, you have to work with 96. So there's some 96 in the studio as well. And as well, there are even more exotic glasses. I have a large parcel of glass that comes from a company in England. It was purchased by a fellow in the 80s. And he donated it to me to use for teaching the students. And the COE for that glass is around 90. Which is fairly low. When you get all the way to Pyrex, Pyrex has a COE of 50. And people do work in Pyrex, but they use a larger torch than the one we have here. But the pieces that they make don't need to be annealed. They can be just let to cool right on the shelf. And you've seen people possibly doing this, making little pieces in the mall, little dragons and things like that, I mean clear glass. they're actually using borosilicate glass or Pyrex, and that's why they don't need a kiln to anneal things afterwards. Well, there are the basic aspects of understanding how bead making happens are, how hot does it have to be to make the glass melt? How do you get the glass bead off of the stick that you're making it on? Why do you have to cool it down carefully so that it doesn't crack? How do you get it off the stick afterwards? Things like that. And of course, always the number one rule in my studio is don't touch the hot glass bead, because they do look incredibly pretty, and it's just slightly glowing. And people are used to working with things like polymer clay or paper, or just picking up stone beads in the bead making shop, and they want to touch them because craft is a very tactile thing. And yes, 1 out of every 45, 50 people will touch the hot glass bead, and that's why I have the extra large tube of ozonol, and also my St. John's Ambulance first aid kit to handle the boo-boos in bead making class. I'm wearing special glasses. They filter out the bright yellow flare that you see. That's the sodium in the glass that's burning off in the heat of the flame. This torch is you can make a high oxygen environment, and it means that the glasses all stay very true to the colors by rolling it in other colors which have been...
Anything else?
Anything else? Don't touch the hot glass bead.